Setting then, setting and its referential function, serving as a bridge between the story, the plot, and the world to which the story refers. The world the story is about. When we say, what's that story about? We might answer, it's about these larger issues, these larger universal themes. We might also say, well, it's a story about 19th century America. It's a story about 20th century China in the Hunan province. Jason writes, quote, according to the Norton, in good fiction, setting always functions as an integral part of the whole. In The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the setting serves as an important function to the story. The time is clearly mid to late 1800s, a colonial mansion, a hereditary estate. The Yellow Wallpaper represents her personal mental illness and her desire to be heard. It is repeated, of course, by the breaths, but not otherwise. It becomes so dominant in her mind because of the societal treatment of women and the view of mental illness-based issues, which are causing her to be ignored. I think she is constantly ignored due to the time era's view on mental illness. So you can see that Jason sees the setting as, in fact, establishing connections between the story, what happens in the story, the treatment of the woman especially, right, who is in bed for much of the story, and the world around her. What are the connections between her and the world around her? Yes, her husband is a doctor, right? Is he a medieval doctor? Is he an apothecary out of some medieval story? No, right? Is he a 21st century neurologist? No, he's not. Of course, she wrote this long before the 21st century. How could he be unless this was science fiction? The story is set. The story is setting. The story is set in a particular time in a particular place. And to the extent that it is set in a particular time in a particular place, and the particularities of time and place seem to be sketched in for us and seem to have this importance, then I think you see this point, don't you? You see this referential function of setting, which is to establish, again, okay, some sort of relevance in the mind of the reader, of what the reader is reading, right? What the reader becomes aware of is that this is not a story of just some husband. It's a husband who happens to be a doctor, who in fact is a representative of a certain set of institutional habits and institutional practices and a larger social, right, norm, a larger society that has its own set of practices, its own set of arrangements, correct? Which I think many of you would agree that in the story, according to Charlotte Perkins Gilman, could be described as patriarchal. Notice what Tiffany writes. Adams and Harpham describe setting as the element of the story, quote, that generates the conflicts, defines the characters, and gives the story purpose and meaning. So much so that there would be little, if any, story left if all the details somehow transported to a different time, place, and social milieu. And I think that's a very nice quote on the part of Tiffany, and in fact, it calls our attention to precisely the point I have been making by way of this term referential. Imagine resetting, doing a reset, resetting the story, right, in Renaissance Italy. Think about that, okay? Reset the story in Renaissance Italy, what changes? I think lots of things would change. Reset the story, make it set at the in that world occupied by Montresor and Fortunato, and I think you have a very different story. It's much less of a critique of institutions, especially the medical institution, right, would, I think, be served by such a resetting. Because, in fact, quote-unquote doctors were not even really distinguished as such at that time. And the whole notion of a profession, of a medical profession, right, of physicians who are part of a medical profession, and what a big part that is, the so-called medical advice that she gets in the story to stay put and to suffer, or they would say benefit from, the rest cure, as it was called, right? That would not be a target of the story. And the setting would be just a little less important, it seems to me, if it were set, for example, in the Renaissance, right? When the specific institutional target of the story would fade away. Ellen and Jose wrote, in Jose's words, and I think I could have added a few others into this list of those who found this next quote I'm about to read an important one, right? In Jose's words, Abrams and Harpham define setting as, quote, the general locale, historical time, and social circumstances in which its action occurs. And again, a colonial mansion, a hereditary state in the late 1800s. We have that locale, in this case, not really all that general, fairly specific, right? I guess general in the sense that it's just colonial. It's just a mansion, which indicates wealth. A hereditary estate, in other words, some sort of patriarchal, this notion of a patriarchal kind of property-owning class where properties are transmitted generation after generation. Probably, patrilinear, not matrilinear, this particular culture, right? This particular locale and historical time and the social circumstances, all of those things get sketched in by way of setting, by way of the author carefully setting the fiction in a particular time in a particular place. From the referential to the atmospheric, pretty close to the symbolic, but not identical. The atmospheric use of setting establishes mood. It creates an emotional weather, so to speak, through which the characters will be making their ways. Often enough, the atmospheric is created by way of reports on the weather. Characters often acknowledge it now and then, try to ignore it or defy it implicitly, if not explicitly, and even come to discover it as a truth that has thus far eluded them. I'm thinking of the endings of stories in which the sun comes out and the setting itself, seems to offer something of a comment on prospects and hopes of the character at hand. Now, you could say that's a symbol, right? You could. So you're going to see at times a bordering between of the atmospheric on the symbolic and the symbolic on the atmospheric to such a degree that you're going to feel as though the distinction is really not all that important to make. But I want to give you one example of what seems to me to be, perhaps in all the English language, that's a pretty bold claim, isn't it? But perhaps in all the English language, one of the greatest examples of such mood setting as would, I think, constitute evidence that we really do want this term atmospheric, okay? Because you wouldn't quite call this symbolic. You'd call some of what I'm about to read symbolic, but I think you'd mostly call it atmospheric. It's establishing, once again, a kind of emotional context for the story, okay, in which the characters then will move. It's almost as though the emotions of the author, okay, are just writ large in the scenery, okay, in such a way as to constitute an authorial presence, okay, against which the characters move, and which conditions our sense of the characters, right? Serves characterization. It serves a lot of ends, but characterization is one of the most obvious. And you can imagine that a dreary situation in which we had a character who was resolutely remaining cheerful, you can imagine how that would help us to characterize that particular character, right? It would help the author to do so and enable us to grasp that character as remarkably plucky, for example, in the face of horrible weather. Horrible weather, not of the kind of where you're rained upon so much as the kind where it's actually part of the plot of the story, right? But more like just kind of sitting out there. It's very depressing, and somehow it doesn't bother the character. The character refuses to allow it to bother her as she goes about her business. That character may come across as more heroic than not. But let's get to that famous example. Perhaps you will recognize it. Maybe not, but I, in fact, label it there at the very end. Here it goes. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I almost want to pause. Let's press on another sentence or two. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of that half pleasurable, because poetic sentiment, upon which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate or terrible. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveler upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. There was an iciness, a sinking, a sickening of the heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought to which no goading of the imagination could torture into aught of the sublime. Okay, that's perhaps enough. I've included some of the rest of this opening paragraph of the famous The Fall of the House of Usher, which maybe some of you read before. It's one of my favorite short stories of all the 19th century, all 19th century American literature, that's for sure. But I think it's a pretty good example of what we're talking about here. I mean, you do have, do you not, the symbolic. It's here. I think there are moments where the house, for example, becomes a symbol, right? Where would that happen? Okay, when would you have the symbolic? Well, I think the line, I looked upon the scene before me, the mere house, the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls. Not there. Walls can be bleak and they don't really symbolize much, aside from bleakness, but that's atmospheric, isn't it? But look at the next line. Upon the vacant eye-like windows. We move on quickly, upon a few rank sedges and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, which again returns us to the atmospheric register from the symbolic. Now, we haven't quite gotten to the symbolic. That's our next plate. But already, do you not see a manipulation of setting to symbolic effect? The vacant eye-like windows. It's as though the house of Usher is staring upon him. That's the title of the story. You've already read the title of the story by the time you've read this paragraph. The house of Usher stares upon him. Vacancy, staring upon him through its windows, as it were, which, by the way, return at the very end of the paragraph. They stare upon him with the vacancy of a kind of non-present subject, a subject that is there but not there, not all there, right? As it stares out of these windows contained within the house. Drop down to that final sentence where he says, acting upon this idea, he's just had an idea. He reports, reining his horse to the precipitous brink of a black and lurid tarn that, again, I see as more atmospheric than specifically, pointedly symbolic. A black and lurid tarn that lay in unruffled luster by the dwelling. And he gazes down and looks in the tarn. But with a shudder even more thrilling than before, what does he see? He says he looks upon the remodeled, which I think means mirrored, the remodeled and inverted images of the gray sedge and the ghastly tree stems and the vacant and eye-like windows. So a lot of attention here at the end of the paragraph is called, I think, to those windows by the choice of the image of the vacant and eye-like windows as the terminal image of this this paragraph that's just so full of images, right? And I think it calls a little bit of attention to a particular element of the setting that, once again, I would distinguish from the atmospheric portions of the setting, which is the great majority of what we have happening in this paragraph. And this, which strikes me as more specifically symbolic, where the family, not just the house of Usher, the family of the Ushers, the whole, if you've read the story, you'll know what I'm talking about, the lineage of the Ushers, the whole long history of the Usher family, okay, can now but look out of the windows of the house that symbolizes their continuance, their continuation in the present. They can only look out vacantly upon him, and he feels the gaze upon him, and it feels, I think you would agree, a little bit unsettling, okay? So this strikes me as just a little bit more than establishing a kind of, contingent of emotions that are extant, that just sit out in the landscape, sit out in the, in the kind of surrounding context of the scene, okay? And again, seem to represent some kind of authorial presence here. And the feelings, it's almost as though that's how the author feels. Okay, is somehow communicated by these, and there's some suggestion that that's how we ought to feel, and is somehow communicated by these various elements, which are here, by the way. One of the things that makes it such an amazing example is that, of course, we see the character report on the precise emotional content of the atmosphere, of this atmospheric setting, when he tells you that as he looks at the building. And again, the weather is there. We've got clouds hanging oppressively low in the heavens, right? So it's a cloudy day, dull, dark, and soundless in the autumn of the year, right? So we in a sense, we have the weather, we have the seasons. It's not just that, it's also the building. So it's not just the weather when you've got the atmosphere, or not just the sky, not literally atmosphere. Atmosphere is a metaphor. So you also have the building, but you look at the building, and how is the building, upon the first glimpse of the building, if you're the main character, and we have this, again, precise, wonderfully exemplary and precise emotional equivalent or emotional effect of the atmosphere is reported in this moment. So if somebody said to you, well, what are the emotions communicated by the choice of elements included in the setting of the opening of the fall of the House of Usher, you'd be able to just smile and pick up the book, pick up the story, and just quote, I would say, quote, a sense of insufferable gloom pervading the spirit. And you'd be right. The symbolic, then, the third of our three, the referential, the atmospheric, and the symbolic. This one's pretty clear, isn't it? Authors manipulate elements of setting, not in order to create social and historical reference points and relevancies, which was the first, the referential. Not in order, the second, the atmospheric, not in order to establish an emotional tone, which they might wish to do for any number of characterological reasons, though also for other reasons, sometimes even referential ones, right? But in order to create precise correspondences by means of which to advance the plot and clarify the theme. And if you're not especially happy with that definition of the symbolic, its vagueness as such, I mean, that covers a lot of ground, doesn't it? This notion that you're manipulating setting symbolically, okay, when you create precise correspondences by means of which you advance the plot and clarify the theme. It covers a lot of ground. Lots of literary territory is created by that definition. If you find that almost so general as not to be really all that useful, I don't think you're alone. I mean, it's just so much is done by means of symbols in stories, and when the symbols are part of the setting, okay, just as much is done, right? Just as much is done when the symbol is an element of setting, when the symbol is hanging up on the wall, as it is when it's in somebody's hands and isn't precisely what we would call an element of setting. So that's just the nature of symbolic action, so to speak, and symbolic intention and symbolic usage, and just the phenomena of symbolism in literature is just a very complicated and diffuse area of literary event, okay? Real quickly, what about atmospherics in Gilman? This is left over from the most recent, from the previous play. Monica wrote, the narrator of the story states that the wall color is, quote, repellent, almost revolting, a smoldering, unclear, or unclean yellow. And I thought in that moment, Monica was coming very close to pointing to an atmospheric use of setting by Gilman, okay? Because you will see she's stopping short. And here we see that distinction, don't we? The distinction between the atmospheric and the symbolic. Monica's calling attention to a moment in the story in which the wall paper, okay, the wall color, is really more atmospheric than symbolic, right? The color, the smell, I think if you talk about the smell, you get a little bit of that as well. It's puts you off, it's repellent, it's almost revolting. That's what we read. A smoldering, unclean yellow, and that's how it strikes the narrator, right? And you can see, here's an example that almost referential use. I mean, do you see how these things can all come together in certain very specific moments, right? The referential, the atmospheric, and the symbolic, which I think typically are found separated, and that's why we have three different terms, right? Typically they are found not coinciding. But you can imagine that, the smoldering, unclean, yellowing, stale and wasted look of the wallpaper, establishes a kind of atmosphere for her incarceration, virtually, right? Her sojourn in the room. I don't know. It tells us something about what it is that's encasing her, right? Yes, that's more symbolic, but it tells us, yeah, just with the uncleanness, the smoldering quality, the yellowness, that she's, as it were, incarcerated in a kind of emotional condition, right? Of stagnancy and of it's this almost revolting quality. There's something sort of very nauseating and stagnant about this world. It's not the space she's in, the nursery. I mean, think of the irony there, right? Oops, there goes my book. Think of the irony of a nursery that would have these qualities, okay? Because these qualities are not those that we would associate with nurturing, or nursing along into further development or better health. A nursery, typically, as we know, this nursery is originally was intended for children. And so the whole idea is not so much nursing somebody back to good health as what we find the usage to which it's put in the story. But originally, the intention was, in fact, to rear the child and bring the child into its healthy potentiality. Well, something of a authorial comment here, isn't it? The author almost seems to be commenting on, this institution of this house that is seized upon, of course, by the doctor and by the various other representatives of the patriarchal society of the story as the proper place to stick, the narrator in order to get her healthy, which you don't really get the feeling it's going to work very well, do you? And I think the atmosphere, the way that the story setting is manipulated to create an atmosphere of repulsion and something that's kind of smoldering. You get the feeling that something's going on, but it's not real healthy. It's more like something's on fire and being destroyed than some burgeoning good health going on here. The uncleanliness of it and the yellowness that is associated with something that's past its date, right? Not growing into something new and better, but developing into its, as it might, given its nature, but rather something that has run its course. Okay, and it's an old house, and you get it all. And then you're bordering on the symbolic at that point, to the extent that we imagine it's an old house of the colonial patriarchy, as some of you mentioned when we were talking about the relevancies and historical reference points of the story. So you see atmosphere and reference kind of coming together there for a second. And it wouldn't be too difficult to make it symbolic as well, right? Even here, while we're in the presence of relevancies and also of this business of the atmospheric. Well, what about the symbolic then, right? It's not just, almost everybody who wrote on this, and a bunch of you did, almost everybody who wrote on this question wrote about the wallpaper symbolic. Jill wrote, quote, Abram's Harfam identifies symbol as, quote, a word or phrase that signifies an object or event which in its turn signifies something or suggests a range of reference beyond itself. Doesn't that definition testify to just what a common and widespread and how much ground is covered by this term simple? We use that to mean a lot of different things, and to cover, again, a lot of different literary episodes and events are called symbolic. Now, Jill goes on to say the obvious symbol in the yellow wallpaper is clearly the wallpaper, right? And she wants to say that, look, the use of setting here, to the extent that the wallpaper represents a use of setting, is symbolic rather than atmospheric, right? But she goes on to say, I would argue there's another symbol right at the beginning of the story, a haunted house, and I thought that was charming and interesting. Indeed, setting itself in the story is a symbol of unease and fear. In that moment, we almost get a little atmospheric, don't we, for a second? This notion of unease and fear sound like those emotions kind of put in place and established early on by the author, and against which the characters must make his way or her way and struggle to a degree and define himself or herself, right? But, you know, I suppose what I'd want to say to Jill, and I think a number of others of you more or less say, implicitly, is not the wallpaper also an element of setting? Joanna thinks so. Quote, the setting in the yellow wallpaper is extremely significant as it doubles as both setting and symbolism. So, you have that. I mean, you've got, what is the setting of the story? I mean, the setting, is it, right, is the setting the house? Is the setting the wallpaper inside the house? And you can see how some wanted to see the wallpaper as purely a symbol and not part of the setting. And Jill wanted to see it that way. And the setting is the house. And what about the room in the house, the nursery? I had a word about that just a moment ago, and then we can turn to what Rebecca has to say. Let's not leave the house behind too soon. She wrote, in the Norton we read that fiction often relies on setting to establish mood, situation, and character. Many times Gilman's speaker mentions details of the room and it seems bad, but she doesn't mind the room. Notice Rebecca's focus on the room that I think coheres nicely with Jill's sense of the room, the house. She focuses more on the house than the room. Rebecca gets us inside the house, but doesn't forget about the structure, the edifice as itself an element of setting that is symbolic, right? Quote, but I don't mind it a bit, only the paper. That's an interesting moment, for somebody who's writing a paper on setting, and these three usages of the term, because it's almost as though the main character, the speaker, the main character of the story, in that moment says, no, the paper is the only thing that really functions as a powerful element of setting or as a symbol. It's as though the room, now, by the way, this isn't true, right? It's just she says it in that one moment. She does mind the room. I think she really does mind the room because she's the one who tells us all about the previous use of the room as a nursery and borders upon an acknowledgement herself of that irony that we acknowledged a few moments ago about the room as being a nursery, right? And now she's in it, and it's like a different kind of nursery now. It's more literally a nursery, a place where nursing is going on, as opposed to this nursing up and nurturing of young children. So I think she does, at some level, it does bother her, but it's just a funny moment in the middle of this exercise for her to actually distinguish between room and paper, as though taking a position in our debate at this point, as to what is setting and what functions significantly as setting, what is symbolic. I don't know that she'd say it's only the paper that's a symbol, or it's only the paper is even a setting. If she did think that it was only the paper that was a setting, it's as though what she'd be saying is that the other elements of setting really don't function except to be fairly neutral. They don't do much in the way of atmospherics. They don't do much in the way of reference. They're just out there, just kind of holding place, right? In other words, I think she should mind the paper. I'm sorry, she should mind the room. Because the room, and I think Rebecca does too, because Rebecca goes on to say the room that she's trapped in is a symbol of her mind. And notice how Rebecca distinguishes between the wallpaper and the room. The wallpaper representing the restrictions put on her by John and Jerry, such as no writing. The paper engulfed her mind and eventually held back the insanity that she was holding back when she ripped it away. She let loose the crazy thought she was holding back and became a new person as the room became a new room without the ugly wallpaper. And I thought that was deft, and I thought very interesting. Most people did not make that distinction between room and wallpaper, and Rebecca both made it and developed it, explored it a bit, and I think to good effect. Okay, it's a symbol. The wallpaper's a symbol, let's say. What is it a symbol of, right? Or what are the walls with the wallpaper on them a symbol of? So I think we've gotten to that point in our conversation where there's this general consensus, right? That, the wallpaper, whatever you think of the room, the wallpaper certainly is, right? It's a symbol of something. What's it a symbol of then? Well, Monica said, and I'm just going to take you on a little tour of some of the things that you guys had to say about this, which I think they're largely in agreement with some interesting little departures here and there. Monica wrote, I believe that the woman who's trapped within the wall symbolizes the main character of the story. More specifically, how she feels. The main character suffers from a nervous condition which causes her to be observed. She's always locking the doors during the daylight, creeping around. We also see the woman in the walls with the same pattern. The woman creeps around the long shaded lane, around the garden during the daytime, hiding from the other people who stare at her. And we have a version of that going on inside the wall, so to speak. She uses the same characters to describe herself and the woman in the wall, where it's like creeping around in the daylight. I wonder if they all come out of the wallpaper as I did. And we get this kind of identification between her finally towards the end of the story, between her and the woman in the wallpaper who've been kept apart, in the earlier part of the story. And it's as though she's looking at some other person and not looking, as she looks at the woman crawling around in the patterns, and not seeing a projection of her own condition, not being able to read it as such. And one could argue that she comes to sanity, to the extent that she comes to sanity, only when she can do that, when she can see this correspondence and see that she's been, in a sense, reading herself the whole time, though not aware that she was reading herself as she's been making sense of the woman in the wall, right? Chris wrote, the symbols we see by the end are a woman grappling with her own unhappiness and the apparition she sees trapped in the wallpaper, which is a manifestation of herself in unhappiness. You see this agreement between you. These symbols cause the reader to feel anxiety throughout the story when she's detailing her life in the queerness of the wallpaper. Gillen does a great job of interrelating the setting and the symbols, which gives the story an emotional punch, and I couldn't agree more. Jessica agrees that the woman trapped in the wallpaper is symbolizing the speaker's own feelings of confinement within this house, and this is, once again, a consensus. Here we see a strong consensus between Monica, Chris, and Jessica about the fundamental symbolic correspondences going on in the story. The wallpaper, I want to go back to Rebecca. That's interesting how the wallpaper has to be sort of bust through. The wallpaper is, it's as though you can't leave the room out entirely to make this work. But I think maybe you can if you just distinguish between room and walls. You see how it gets, see how complicated it gets? We have to speak of the walls apart from the room conceivably apart from the house, and the wallpaper apart from the walls to make it really, really work really, really well. But the wall seems to be this sort of foundation or backdrop or space upon which or in which the woman trapped in the wallpaper lives. And as Rebecca was saying, the paper seems to come between the speaker and the wallpaper. And I think Jessica here is, bordering upon that. She's the woman trapped upon Rebecca's precise sense of the way that these correspondences function, right? Or the way these various elements correspond is a simpler way of putting it. Jessica agrees that the woman trapped in the wallpaper and has to make her way out of the wallpaper, which sounds a lot like what Rebecca was saying. And the woman, the woman herself, the speaker, right, being confined within the house, confined within the room. So you can see how that we begin to get that more precise sense of wallpaper versus wall, right? The wallpaper itself being a place, being a kind of containing element, a confining element that the paper itself somehow has to be bust through. And back behind the paper is almost a place of refuge, which is interesting. Jessica goes on, just like herself constantly being observed by her husband and her sister-in-law, the woman in the wallpaper is always being watched by the speaker. She's exploring that correspondence, which I think is a very valuable thing to do, if for no other reason than to establish the correspondence more surely and compellingly. And it goes on to talk about the doors, the locks on the doors, which I think are interesting. Ellen adds, quote, the yellow wallpaper then symbolizes the mental instability inside the speaker's mind with the irrational patterns and the woman that is trapped inside of it. A passage that stood out to me was a part with a woman. So up to this point, Ellen is completely in consensus. Let's see what happens next. A passage that stood out to me was a part where the woman was describing the wallpaper, quote, when you follow the lame on certain curves for a little distance, they suddenly commit suicide, plunge off at outrageous angles, destroy themselves in unheard of contradictions. This, to me, Ellen writes, speaks to the woman's current state of mind as possibly suicidal, which is why she was put in this room in the first place. As we see in the text, the woman just had a baby, and postpartum, we know what that is. Kind of a postpartum episode is one of the ways to explain what's going on in the story. But you can see how, I don't know that Ellen really does depart as she gets very specific, and I think very helpful in picking out that one of the more intriguing lines in a long series, I think you would agree, of intriguing little lines that develop this set of correspondences, right? When you follow the lame on certain curves for a little distance, I almost want to say sick, but never mind. The lame on certain curves for a little distance, they suddenly commit suicide, plunge off at outrageous angles, destroy themselves in unheard of contradictions. And, it's, I don't know, like a premonition, as I think Ellen is suggesting, of a possibly suicidal state. And reading here, the woman seems to be reading here in the kind of space occupied, the lame on certain curves, which are negotiated by the woman who's stuck in the wallpaper, right? And which are faced by her as that confront her as a kind of challenge. She, in a sense, anticipates one possible outcome, right? That it's funny, it's complex and interesting. I mean, the outcome is, as Ellen just said, the outcome that she's here anticipating is that of suicide, the suicide of the woman in the wall, and also of herself, because of course the woman is in a sense a projection of her own feelings and her sense of her own condition, even though she doesn't recognize the woman in the wall as such for a long time. You could argue that maybe she never really does. But it's interesting, isn't it, that the uncertain curves are what are said to suddenly commit suicide, plunging off at outrageous angles, destroying themselves in unheard of contradictions. And I found that a very interesting, kind of choice on the part of Gilman, which I think is to indicate that, that this, I don't know, some sort of doubt about if suicide does occur, that it would really be chosen. Can you kind of get that? And you can see how carefully, symbolically, the setting is being manipulated at this point to clarify a certain theme. And that theme would be the extent to which this speaker is really in control. Isn't she just following the pattern? She's following the pattern that's been set for her. And this, of course, is worked out, right? The corresponding situation of the woman inside the wallpaper, following the lame on certain curves for a little distance. If she commits suicide, it's going to be because they commit suicide. If she plunges off at an outrageous angle and disappears meaninglessly out of life, isn't it because she's been instructed to follow the pattern, right? She's been taught to follow convention and to obey and imitate the models. And this is what the models tell her to do. This is what the pattern indicates is what happens if you do as you should, right? At the same time, there's a characterization of just how lame and wacky this thing is, and how outrageous and unheard of, even though it seems to be the destiny that faces her if she's going to continue to do what she's been asked to do and what she's been told to do. Well, Therese follows up with, quote, setting may entail not only the physical environment of the work, but also the social, psychological, or spiritual state of the participants. In the yellow wallpaper, quote, the setting clearly represents what it is like to live with a mental health issue. It is like being locked in an ugly yellow nursery with no hope of ever escaping, with everyone acting acting like time and rest will fix everything. One just becomes more crazy and restless. The woman in the wallpaper, perhaps meant to represent the heroine's mind, starts to act out more. She is restless and starts to become more vocal. And Therese is getting us back just on the straight and narrow set of correspondences that we have, and kind of reestablishing here wanted to put her last because it's just such a nice reestablishment of the basic correspondences that we have in the story between setting and the main character, okay, the speaker, by way of all this complexity that involves her projecting herself by way of this woman in the wall, behind the wallpaper, all that stuff that we've been talking about, and all the very complex little manipulations, right, of the correspondences that we have, that are explored a bit by Ellen, and that I just explored a bit myself a moment ago. Well, this is one of those weeks where I've got 1,000 things to say to you. We do have an assignment coming up. I wish I could, in other words, I wish I had more time to explore this with you here in the video. If we had a class and I could hold your attention, which I would be able to do if we had an hour and 15 minutes instead of a video. we would continue to explore. But you've got a little one-pager coming up, right? And I have found that these mini lectures really ought to remain relatively mini. So I'm not going to keep it going at this point. So have a good weekend. And those of you who wrote about some of the other questions, don't think because I didn't bring you up, I stuck with Gilman, which this was the item that most people answered, okay? And so I decided to stick with it. There were just some really wonderful answer/responses to the other items as well. So if that we did not get to them, do not take that as a sign that you didn't do a nice job this week. So keep your eyes open for the granular modular schedule tomorrow, right on Friday in the afternoon, early afternoon. I'll probably post it. So keep your eyes open for that. That'll be coming. And I'm also going to start to post, like the one-pager assignment prompt, as well as the prompt for the squib, which is due about 10 days after the next one-pager. So have a good weekend. Keep the reading going, and talk to you later. Bye-bye.